Deep inside the Philippine jungle lived a mysterious hermit. For over 30 years, he lived alone, growing rice and vegetables, hunting wild boars, and occasionally killing people. But when authorities finally found him, they discovered something shocking. He wasn't a crazy hermit at all. He was a Japanese soldier who'd been ordered to never surrender. His name was Hiro Onoda, and his story is one of the most incredible tales of obedience ever heard. In the summer of 1944, the Second World War was raging. As the Allies closed in on Berlin, German soldiers were ordered to fight to the very end. And in the Pacific, Japanese commanders faced a terrible choice: surrender or die. But far from the front lines, on the small island of Lubang, young soldier Hiro Onoda had no idea what was going on. That was because he'd been given orders to never leave his post. And these orders came directly from Japan's highest military command. Onoda had been stationed on Lubang since March of 1943, and by the time August rolled around, he'd grown accustomed to life in the jungle. He hunted wild pigs, caught fish in local streams, and collected rainwater in a coconut shell. But soon, other soldiers joined him, and together, the men built trenches, dugouts, and even makeshift machine gun nests. Their goal was simple: fight the Americans to the death. When the Japanese army began losing ground across the Pacific, some soldiers started to panic. They wanted to surrender, but Onoda refused to let them. He said if the Japanese army fell back, he'd rather die than become a prisoner of the enemy. Most of the soldiers ignored him. They knew the war was hopeless. But Onoda and his fellow soldiers who stayed behind didn't realize that yet. Then on August 15th, 1945, Japan announced their surrender. The war was over. Soon, celebratory messages were being dropped over the Philippine Islands by American airplanes. But these messages never reached Onoda. In fact, he actually shot at those planes because he thought they were enemies. Then in October, another group of Japanese soldiers approached Onoda. They were coming from the north, and they said they'd come to help him hold his position. But as soon as Onoda saw their insignia, he realized they weren't there to help. These soldiers were from a different division, and they also believed the war was still going on. So instead of working together, the two groups of soldiers fought each other. In the end, everyone was dead except Onoda and 3 of his friends. From that point on, Onoda and his 3 friends lived in near isolation, hunting wild boars, drinking coconut water, and trying to contact the Japanese army. But the only response they got was the deafening silence of the jungle. Then slowly, the 3 other soldiers began to lose hope. They wanted to end their own lives, but according to Japanese law, that was forbidden. Even if the war was over, a soldier couldn't kill himself. So they starved themselves to death. And meanwhile, Onoda continued to wait. He didn't know how long he'd been in the jungle, nor did he care. All that mattered was following his orders. He just had to keep holding his position. But where did these orders come from? Well, as the war drew to a close, Japan's top military brass desperately tried to figure out what to do. Many soldiers had already surrendered, but others were hiding in remote areas, refusing to give up. So in order to deal with these rogue soldiers, the Japanese army created a special task force. Their job was to track down hidden soldiers and bring them home. At first, the task force tried normal methods. They contacted the families of missing soldiers and asked them to convince their loved ones to surrender. But that didn't work. So then they tried something more drastic. High-ranking officers were flown into jungle areas where soldiers were hiding. They met with the soldiers face-to-face and encouraged them to come home. But this also failed. Finally, desperate times called for desperate measures. The Japanese military started dropping leaflets from airplanes over jungles all over Southeast Asia. These leaflets contained important information for Japanese soldiers. They explained that the war was over and that they should surrender. They also warned that soldiers who continued to fight would be considered traitors. But Hiro Onoda never saw those leaflets. He just assumed they were part of an elaborate Allied plan to trick him. So year after year, Onoda waited. Eventually, he even grew a beard and long, scraggly hair. But no matter how much time passed, Onoda refused to give up. He didn't know that he was the last Japanese soldier still fighting in the jungle. But by the 1970s, people began to notice strange things. Sometimes farmers saw a Japanese soldier in the jungle, always armed with a rifle. Sometimes they even heard gunfire. So the local authorities decided to investigate. In 1974, a Filipino mayor and his men entered the jungle in search of the mysterious sniper. But just as they were about to find him, he slipped away. Luckily, the mayor managed to get a photograph of Onoda. It quickly became the most famous picture in the Philippines. Meanwhile, back in Japan, a young man named Norio Suzuki was looking for something strange. He wanted to find the legendary Yeti, a giant panda, and a Japanese soldier still fighting World War II. Suzuki never expected to find any of these things, but somehow he found Onoda. When Suzuki found Onoda, he was living in a hut made of bamboo and palm leaves. And when he showed the soldier a copy of the local newspaper, Onoda tore it up. He knew the Japanese army would never abandon him. But Suzuki told Onoda that the war had been over for 30 years and urged him to come back to Japan. Onoda shook his head. He said the only way he would surrender was if his commanding officer told him to. But there was one problem. That same commanding officer was a frail old man living in a nursing home in Tokyo. The Japanese government decided to act fast. Onoda had been charged with dozens of murders, and it was becoming difficult to keep him hidden. Plus, Suzuki promised to help locate Onoda's old commanding officer. So the government agreed. They flew the old soldier to the Philippines, dressed him in his old uniform, and introduced him to Onoda. The reunion was short. Onoda immediately saluted his commander and asked if he was there to help him fight the enemy. But his commander had other orders. He handed Onoda a letter from the Japanese Defense Agency, explaining that the war had been over for 30 years. And finally, Onoda lowered his rifle. At that moment, thousands of cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions, but Onoda remained silent. A few days later, he boarded a plane to Japan and stepped off as a hero. Some people cheered, while others criticized him for the killings he'd committed. But most were just glad he'd finally come home. For a brief period, Onoda traveled all over Japan giving interviews. But soon he became tired of talking about himself and retreated to his rural hometown. There he married a woman named Mitsuko and opened a farm. Eventually, life returned to normal for Onoda. People stopped asking him questions, and he stopped making headlines. But in 2014, Hiro Onoda died of stomach cancer. He was 91 years old. Now, when the news broke, many people felt a sense of relief. Finally, the last Japanese soldier of World War II had died, but others felt sadness. After all, Onoda had been loyal to his country for longer than anyone else. One person who understood this was Norio Suzuki, the man who'd found Onoda in the jungle. Suzuki said that Onoda's actions were the ultimate example of loyalty. He also said that Onoda wasn't crazy. He'd simply followed his orders. So what do you think? Was Hiro Onoda the ultimate hero of loyalty, a tragic victim of his situation, or something else entirely? Let us know in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, thanks for watching.